Good morning. This is Ron. It is Sunday, March the 4th. Welcome to Story Time. And this morning is part 2 of Faith and Force, chapter 7 of Philosophy, Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. And yesterday in the part 1, she was discussing the big differences between reason and mysticism. Now, if you ask me to name the man who's most responsible for the present state of the world, a man whose influence has almost succeeded in destroying the achievements of the Renaissance, I will name Immanuel Kant. He was the philosopher who served the morality of altruism, who knew that what it had to be saved from was reason. This is not a mere hypothesis. It is a known historical fact that Kant's interest and purpose in philosophy was to save the morality of altruism, which could not survive without a mystic base. His metaphysics and his epistemology were devised for that purpose. He did not, of course, announce himself as a mystic. Few of them have since the Renaissance. He announced himself as a champion of reason, of pure reason. There are two ways to destroy the power of a concept. One, by an open attack and open discussion. The other, by subversion, from the inside. That is, by subverting the meaning of the concept, setting up a straw man and then refuting it. Kant did the second. He did not attack reason, he merely constructed such a version of what is reason that it made mysticism look like plain, rational common sense by comparison. He did not deny the validity of reason, he merely claimed that reason is limited, that it leads us to impossible contradictions, that everything we perceive is an illusion, and that we can never perceive reality or things as they are. He claimed, in effect, that the things we perceive are not real because we perceive them. A straw man is an odd metaphor to apply to such an enormous, cumbersome, ponderous construction as Kant's system of epistemology. Nevertheless, a straw man is what it was, and the doubts, the uncertainty, the skepticism that followed, the skepticism about man's ability to ever to know anything, were not, in fact, applicable to human consciousness, because it was not a human consciousness that Kant's robot represented. But philosophers accepted it as such, and while they cried that reason had been invalidated, they did not notice that reason had been pushed off the philosophical scene altogether, and that the faculty they were arguing about was not reason. No, Kant did not destroy reason, he merely did as thorough a job of undercutting it as anyone could ever do. If you trace the roots of all of our current philosophies, such as pragmatism, logical positivism, and all the rest of the neo-mystics who announce happily that you cannot prove that you exist, you will find that they all grew out of Kant. As to Kant's version of the altruist morality, he claimed that it was derived from, quote, pure reason, unquote, not from revelation, except that it rested on a special instinct for duty, a, quote, categorical imperative, unquote, which one, quote, just knows, unquote. His version of morality makes the Christian one sound like a healthy, cheerful, benevolent code of selfishness. Christianity merely told man to love his neighbor as himself. That's not exactly rational, but at least it does not forbid man to love himself. What Kant propounded was full, total, abject selflessness. He held that an action is moral only if you perform it out of a sense of duty and derive no benefit from it of any kind, neither material nor spiritual. If you derive any benefit, your action is not moral any longer. This is the ultimate form of demanding that man turn himself into a, quote, shmoo, unquote, the mystic little animal of the Little Abner comic strip that went around seeking to be eaten by somebody. It is Kant's version of altruism that is generally accepted today, not practiced. Who can practice it? But guiltily accepted. It is Kant's version of altruism that people who have never heard of Kant profess when they equate self-interest with evil. It is Kant's version of altruism that's working whenever people are afraid to admit the pursuit of any personal pleasure or gain or motive, whatever men are afraid to confess that they are seeking, uh, whenever men are afraid to confess that they are seeking their own happiness, whenever businessmen are afraid to say that they are making profits, whenever the victims of an advancing dictatorship are afraid to assert their selfish rights. The ultimate monument to Kant and to the whole altruist morality is Soviet Russia. If you want to prove to yourself the power of ideas, and particularly of morality, the intellectual history of the 19th century would be a good example to study. The greatest, unprecedented, undreamed of events and achievements were taking place before men's eyes, but men did not see them and did not understand their meaning, as they do not understand it to this day. I'm speaking of the Industrial Revolution, of the United States, and of capitalism. For the first time in history, men gained control over physical nature and threw off the control of men over men. That is, men discovered science and political freedom. The creative energy, the abundance, the wealth, the rising standard of living for every level of the population were such that the 19th century looks like a fiction utopia, like a blinding burst of sunlight in the drab progression of most of human history. If life on Earth is one standard of value, then the 19th century moved mankind forward more than all the other centuries combined. Did anyone appreciate it? Does anyone appreciate it now? Has anyone identified the causes of that historical miracle? They did not and have not. What blinded them? The morality of altruism. Let me explain this. There are, fundamentally, only two causes of the progress of the 19th century, the same two causes which you will find at the root of any happy, benevolent, progressive era in human history. One cause is psychological, the other existential, or one pertains to man's consciousness, the other to the physical conditions of his existence. The first is reason, the second is freedom. And when I say freedom, I do not mean poetic sloppiness, such as freedom from want, or freedom from fear, or freedom from the necessity of earning a living. I mean freedom from compulsion, freedom from rule by physical force, which means political freedom. These two, reason and freedom, are corollaries, and their relationship is reciprocal. When men are rational, freedom wins. When men are free, reason wins. Their antagonists are faith and force. These also are corollaries. Every period of history dominated by mysticism was a period of statism, of dictatorship, of tyranny. Look at the Middle Ages and look at the political systems of today. The 19th century was the ultimate product and expression of the intellectual trend of the Renaissance and the Age of Reason, which means of a predominantly Aristotelian philosophy. And, for the first time in history, it created a new economic system, the necessary corollary of political freedom, a system of free trade on a free market, capitalism. No, it was not a full, perfect, unregulated, totally laissez-faire capitalism as it should have been. Various degrees of government interference and control still remained, even in America. And this is what led to the eventual destruction of capitalism. But the extent to which certain countries were free was the exact extent of their economic progress. America, the freest, achieved the most. Never mind the low wages and the harsh living conditions of the early years of capitalism, they were all that the national economies of the time could afford. Capitalism did not create poverty, it inherited it. Compared to the centuries of pre-capitalist starvation, the living conditions of the poor in the early years of capitalism were the first chance the poor had ever had to survive. As proof, the enormous growth of the European population during the 19th century, a growth of over 300% as compared to the previous growth of something like 3% per century. Now, why was this not appreciated? Why did capitalism, the truly magnificent benefactor of mankind, arouse nothing but resentment, denunciations, and hatred then and now? Why did the so called defenders of capitalism keep apologizing for it then and now? Because, ladies and gentlemen, capitalism and altruism are incompatible. Make no mistake about it, and tell it to your Republican friends. Capitalism and altruism cannot coexist in the same man or in the same society. Tell it to anyone who attempts to justify capitalism on the ground of the public good or the general welfare or service to society or the benefit it brings to the poor. All these things are true, but they are the byproducts, the secondary consequences of capitalism, not its goal, purpose, or moral justification. The moral justification of capitalism is man's right to exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others nor sacrificing others to himself. It is the recognition that man, every man, is an end in himself, not a means to the ends of others, not a sacrificial animal serving anyone's need. This is implicit in the function of capitalism. But until now, it has never been stated explicitly in moral terms. Why not? Because this is the base of a morality diametrically opposed to the morality of altruism, which, to this day, people are afraid to challenge. There's a tragic, twisted sort of compliment to mankind involved in this issue. In spite of all their irrationalities, inconsistencies, hypocrisies, and evasions, the majority of men will not act in major issues without a sense of being morally right, and will not oppose the morality they have accepted. They will break it, they will cheat on it, but they will not oppose it. And when they break it, they take the blame on themselves. The power of morality is the greatest of all intellectual powers, and mankind's tragedy lies in the fact that the vicious moral code men have accepted destroys them by means of the best within them. So long as altruism was their moral ideal, men had to regard capitalism as immoral. Capitalism certainly does not and cannot work on the principle of selfless service and sacrifice. This is the reason why the majority of the 19th century intellectuals regarded capitalism as a vulgar, uninspiring, materialistic necessity of this earth, and continued to long for their unearthly moral ideal. From the start, while capitalism was creating the splendor of its achievement, creating it in science, unacknowledged and undefended, morally undefended, the intellectuals were moving in greater and greater numbers towards a new dream, socialism. Just as a small illustration of how ineffectual a defense of capitalism was offered by its most famous advocates, let me mention that the British socialists, the Fabians, were predominantly students and admirers of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. The socialists had a certain kind of logic on their side. If the collective sacrifice of all to all is the moral idea, then they wanted to establish this ideal in practice here and on this earth. The arguments that socialism would not and could not work did not stop them. Neither has altruism ever worked, but this has not caused men to stop and question it. Only reason can ask such questions, and reason, they were told on all sides, has nothing to do with morality. Morality lies outside the realm of reason, so rational morality can ever be defined. The fallacies and contradictions in the economic theories of socialism were exposed and refuted time and time again, in the 19th century as well as today. This did not and does not stop anyone. It is not an issue of economics, but of morality. The intellectuals and the so-called idealists were determined to make socialism work. How? By that magic means of all irrationalists, somehow. It was not the tycoons of big business, it was not the labor unions, it was not the working classes. It was the intellectuals who reversed the trend toward political freedom and revived the doctrines of the absolute state, of totalitarian government rule, of the government's right to control the lives of the citizens in any manner it pleases. This time it was not in the name of the divine right of kings, but in the name of the divine right of the masses. The basic principle was the same, the right to enforce at the point of a gun the moral doctrines of whoever happens to seize control of the machinery of government. There are only two means by which men can deal with one another: guns or logic, force or persuasion. Those who know they cannot win by means of logic have always resorted to guns. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the socialists got their dream. They got it in the 20th century, and they got it in triplicate, plus a great many lesser carbon copies. They got it in every possible form and variant, so that now there can be no mistake about its nature: Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, Socialist England. And that's the end of part 2 of Faith and Force, chapter 7 of the book by Ayn Rand, Philosophy, Who Needs It? And from the back cover, who needs philosophy? Ayn Rand's answer: everyone. This collection of essays was the last work planned by Ayn Rand before her death in 1982. In it, she summarizes her view of philosophy and deals with a broad spectrum of topics. According to Ayn Rand, the choice we make is not whether to have a philosophy, but which one to have: rational, conscious, and therefore practical, or contradictory, unidentified, and ultimately lethal. Written with all the clarity and eloquence that have placed Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy in the mainstream of American thought, these essays range over such basic issues as education, morality, censorship, and inflation to prove that philosophy is the fundamental force in all our lives. So I also wanted to let everybody know the reason that I happen to like Ayn Rand. I have all of her nonfiction works and I guess most of her fiction works. I believe I have, I know I have The Fountainhead, and I think I've got Atlas Shrugged as well, although I haven't read Atlas Shrugged. But that prior to starting to read Ayn Rand, and I've read many of her books several times, 4 or 5 times. And prior to reading Ayn Rand, I was very anxious. I was prone to panic attacks. I was prone to deep depressions. And as I found Ayn Rand to be very therapeutic and very cathartic. There's times when I've read Ayn Rand and the subject matter becomes, the depth of the subject matter and the reality of it becomes overwhelming to the point of inducing a terror. There's no other way to describe it. But on the other side of that terror, once you weather the storm, so to speak, is confidence, real confidence, not the BS ersatz confidence espoused by Hillary Clinton when she says, "Fake it till you make it," but real, honest to God confidence where you know what you're talking about and you know why you know what you're talking about. So coming tomorrow is going to be a Storytime Extra. And until then, thank you very much for joining me and have a great day.